Look at the world around you, the city you live in, the language you speak, the wars that were fought and the ones that were not, the technology in your pocket, the freedoms you exercise. We are taught that history is a river, flowing inevitably towards the sea. But the river is not a river. Welcome to the divergence point. The investigation begins now. The Delaware River in 1776 did not flow, it groaned. Massive chunks of ice, thick as a man's torso, hammered against the hulls of the flat-bottomed boats with a rhythmic, bone-chilling thud. The wood shivered under the impact. Every strike sent a vibration through the deck, traveling up through the soles of boots and into the marrow of the men huddled on board. The air was a razor, cutting through breath and turning moisture into frost on every surface. Men sat in silence, their fingers locked into the wood, knuckles white against the freezing grain. The current was relentless, dragging the flotilla toward a bank shrouded in pitch-black gloom. The water hissed where it met the ice, a constant, abrasive whisper that drowned out all human sound. No orders were shouted, no fires burned. Only the sound of the river and the heavy, metallic smell of impending snow filled the night. They were drifting into the dark, a small, fragile line of wood and iron, pressed against the absolute indifference of a winter that refused to end. The mission hung on the strength of the hulls and the silence of the oars, but the river was already fighting back, turning the water into a graveyard of jagged, shifting glass. At the very front of the lead boat, George Washington stood motionless. His hand gripped the freezing wood of the prow, the knuckles rigid as he leaned into the spray. He did not look back at the men behind him. His eyes were fixed entirely on the shifting, opaque darkness ahead, scanning for the first sign of the landing point. The boat pitched violently as a jagged sheet of ice collided with the bow, but he did not stagger. He held his position, his weight shifted to absorb the sway of the vessel. The wind gusted, carrying the scent of pine and wet stone from the hidden bank. For a heartbeat, the air grew still, the silence deepening until even the scraping of ice against the hull seemed to fade. He tilted his head, listening to the void, his jaw set in a line of absolute focus. He adjusted his grip, the wood biting into his palm. He stood as the anchor point of the entire crossing, a solitary figure carved against the gloom, peering into the night. History sat on that small wooden platform, waiting for a signal that never came. He remained steady, unaware that the direction of the world was about to tilt on this exact, freezing stretch of water. Behind the lead boat, the rest of the fleet moved in a ghost-like procession. Oars dipped into the black water with practiced, shallow strokes, barely disturbing the surface. Every man on board mirrored the stillness of the leader at the prow. They kept their bodies low, shoulders hunched to minimize their profile against the night sky. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic slap of water against timber. Then, the lead boat shuddered. The keel scraped against a submerged sandbar, a harsh, grating vibration that traveled through the entire structure. The movement stopped instantly. Men froze, oars held suspended midair, breath caught in their throats. For 5 seconds, the only reality was the sound of the river rushing past the stalled hull. No one spoke. No one reached for a weapon. They simply waited, counting the heartbeats until the current finally nudged them free and the boat drifted back into the deep channel. They resumed their crawl, the bank now looming as a dark wall of trees just yards away. The soldiers shifted their weight, fingers tightening on their muskets, ready for the landing. They were minutes away from the target, pushing forward with the grim, quiet precision of men convinced they had achieved the impossible. The darkness held until the final moment, concealing the boats in its thick, freezing embrace. Then, the sky tore open. High above the tree line, a magnesium flare ignited, dumping a harsh, artificial white glare onto the river. The water, previously black and hidden, transformed into a mirror of blinding intensity. The ice chunks, once silent ghosts, became sharp, glowing obstacles under the sudden light. Men in the boats threw their hands up to shield their eyes, their silhouettes instantly exposed against the whitewashed surface of the Delaware. The silence shattered. From the high bank, a voice screamed out in a harsh, guttural command. It was a Hessian patrol, their positions clearly marked by the flare. The shout echoed off the water, stripping away the last vestige of stealth. The element of surprise vanished in the span of a single breath. Every man on the water stood frozen, caught in the open, the light revealing their positions to the shore. The patrol scrambled along the ridge, muskets leveled at the river. The advantage had shifted. The river was no longer a path to victory, but a trap. The men looked toward the prow, but the light made it impossible to see anything but the stark, unforgiving reality of the bank. The volley came before the echoes of the shout had even faded. A jagged line of muzzle flashes erupted from the tree line, stuttering against the night like a broken heartbeat. Lead balls hissed through the freezing air, slapping into the wood of the gunwales and kicking up white plumes from the river. The boat lurched as the men ducked, oars tangling in the water. Then, a sharp, singular crack cut through the roar of the musket fire. At the prow, the figure standing against the sky stiffened. He did not cry out. He simply folded, his grip on the wood failing in a slow, unnatural slide. He tipped backward, weight shifting heavily, and collapsed into the bottom of the boat with a dull, sickening thud. The motion of the vessel changed, listing to one side as the weight shifted away from the bow. The command had been severed. The men around him stared at the empty space where he had stood seconds before. No orders followed. No one took the helm. The boat drifted, spinning slowly in the current, while the gunfire from the shore continued to rake the water, meeting no resistance from the silent, paralyzed crew. The sight of the fallen leader acted like a toxin, freezing the men in place. A collective gasp died in their throats, replaced by the sharp, rhythmic slap of lead against the wooden hulls. The Hessians intensified their fusillade, the darkness now alive with streaks of fire. Bullets tore through the thin timber, sending splinters and freezing spray into the faces of the crew. Panic bloomed, erratic and frantic. Men scrambled away from the gunwales, crowding the center of the boats and causing them to rock violently in the icy current. Someone tried to raise a musket, but their hands shook too violently to steady the weapon. The boat drifted aimlessly, a defenseless target in the center of the river. Despair rippled through the ranks, as tangible as the biting wind. The realization set in. The momentum had died with the man at the prow. No one shouted commands. No one rallied the defense. Instead, soldiers huddled low, pressing their bodies against the floorboards to escape the lead rain. The boats were no longer vessels of war. They were floating coffins, drifting toward a shore that had become a wall of flame. Every man watched the still form in the prow, and in that silence, the mission dissolved into the freezing black water. The gray light of dawn crept across the Delaware, revealing the carnage of the night. It caught the faces of the soldiers, etched with exhaustion and the hollow realization of defeat. The firing from the shore had ceased, leaving only the sound of water lapping against the hulls. No one moved to pick up a weapon. No one spoke. The leaderless men simply stared at the mud-slicked banks, their hands stiff from the cold and their spirits broken. One by one, they unbuckled their belts and let their muskets slip into the river. The splash was small, almost insignificant, but it carried the weight of a dying dream. A white cloth, torn from a tunic, was raised high above the central boat. It fluttered weakly in the biting wind, a final, silent admission of failure. The Continental Army had ceased to function as a force. It was now merely a collection of shivering men waiting for the inevitable. The Hessian patrol moved forward, their boots crunching on the frozen earth, and the soldiers did not resist. They stood, hands raised, as the reality settled. The war was over. There was no grand stand, no final shout of defiance, just the cold, the mud, and the quiet acceptance of an end that had arrived before the sun could even fully break the horizon. By the summer of 1777, the silence from the Delaware had reached Philadelphia. The Second Continental Congress did not fall in a single day. It eroded. Day by day, the meeting halls grew emptier. The once crowded benches sat vacant, gathering dust as the realization of the defeat took hold. Arguments that had once defined the future of a nation now echoed against bare walls, unanswered and irrelevant. The dream of independence was formally dismantled, piece by piece, under the weight of crown proclamations. Royal messengers arrived in the city, their presence signaling the end of the rebellion. They posted broadsides on every street corner, declaring the previous months of governance a criminal act of treason. Any remaining semblance of local legislative power was systematically revoked. The ink on the founding petitions dried, never to be signed, while the machinery of the British administration moved in to fill the vacuum. Men who had once debated the rights of citizens now scrambled to secure pardons, burning correspondence and burying records. The city returned to the status quo, the bustle of trade replacing the fervor of revolution. By the height of summer, the Congress was a memory, and the colonies were once again firmly under the absolute jurisdiction of London. The rebellion had been scrubbed from the map, leaving behind only the cold certainty of imperial rule. The architects of the failed rebellion were rounded up in the quiet hours before dawn. Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin were taken from their homes, their desks cleared of every scrap of seditious writing. They were not granted trials. The Crown had already deemed their actions a closed chapter of history. Soldiers escorted them through the narrow, rain-slicked streets of Philadelphia toward the harbor. There was no public outcry, no final attempt at debate. The city watched from behind closed shutters, the fear of imperial reprisal silencing any potential dissent. At the docks, the three men were forced onto separate ships, their belongings searched and confiscated. They stood on the decks, watching the familiar shoreline recede into a gray mist. Their influence had been severed. Every petition, every argument, every vision of a republic was being systematically purged from the colonial record. To the British officials left behind, these men were now merely footnotes, names to be scrubbed from ledgers and forgotten by the public. As the ships caught the wind and moved toward the open Atlantic, the last tangible symbols of the revolution vanished into the dark water. The era of the founders was over, replaced by the rigid, unchanging order of the empire. With the political heart of the colonies pacified, the Crown turned its gaze toward the vast, untamed western frontier. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, once a mere suggestion, became the absolute law of the land, enforced by cold steel. Redcoat garrisons moved deep into the interior, establishing fortified outposts along the jagged spine of the Appalachian Mountains. Surveyors marked the peaks, declaring the wilderness beyond permanently off-limits to colonial expansion. Along the mountain passes, the rhythm of progress changed. Where there had once been the steady rumble of wagon wheels and the constant axework of clearing timber, there was now only the rhythmic march of sentries. A group of settlers, seeking new land, reached the mountain ridge only to be met by a line of leveled muskets. The officer in charge did not debate. He pointed back toward the coast. The message was clear. The westward tide that had defined the colonial spirit for decades hit a wall of imperial granite and stalled. No more land was claimed. No more forests were felled for private homesteads. The mountains became a hard, immovable boundary, sealing the colonies within a tightly controlled corridor. The wild, open horizon was severed, replaced by the watchful gaze of the empire, ensuring that the geography of the continent would remain static, locked firmly under the authority of the crown. Beyond the Appalachian barrier, the landscape remained untouched by the plow and the settler's axe. British diplomats arrived in the Ohio Valley not as conquerors, but as brokers of a new, rigid order. In shadowed groves and open council fires, leaders of the Shawnee, Miami, and Iroquois Confederacy sat across from royal emissaries. They exchanged quill-signed parchments for the guarantee of imperial protection. The treaties were drafted with clinical precision, carving out vast, autonomous protectorates that forbade colonial encroachment. British officers patrolled the borders, turning back any unauthorized surveyors or land-hungry scouts who dared to cross the mountain line. The indigenous nations kept their sovereignty, their ancestral hunting grounds preserved by the very empire that had once sought to displace them. The cycle of forced migration was broken. No lines of desperate families were driven into the interior. No forests were burned to make way for homesteads. The land retained its ancient character, shielded by a geopolitical wall that kept the colonies contained to the east. By the time the ink dried on the final treaty, the geography of the interior had been fundamentally redirected. The expansionist fever that historically ignited wars of displacement was extinguished, replaced by a stable, state-sanctioned peace that kept the indigenous cultures intact and the vast western wilderness firmly under the shadow of the crown. The colonies were no longer a collection of rebellious territories, but a singular, unified dominion under the direct gaze of London. The transformation began in the halls of local governance. Provincial assemblies that once debated independence were shuttered, their doors locked by royal decree. In their place, administrative offices opened, staffed by bureaucrats arriving directly from across the Atlantic. These officials brought a new, rigid ledger system to every port and township. Tax collection became standardized. Shipping routes were locked into a strict imperial circuit. Where once there was chaotic, local experimentation, there was now a methodical, top-down implementation of British law. The former assembly chambers were repurposed into regional counting houses, filled with the scratching of quills and the heavy thud of official stamps. Every governor was appointed from the Crown's own list, ensuring that no local interest could ever outweigh the directives of the central government. The economy was tethered to the global trade network, with every ton of grain and every bale of timber logged in meticulous reports sent back to the capital. The colonies functioned with the quiet, predictable efficiency of a well-oiled machine. By the end of the decade, the concept of a separate American identity had been smoothed away, replaced by a deep, seamless integration into the vast, orderly reach of the British Empire. The year 1833 arrived with a document that shattered the calm of the Dominion. A royal vessel docked in the harbor of Charleston, carrying the text of the Slavery Abolition Act. Messengers fanned out across the southern territories, nailing the decree to the doors of courthouses and public squares. The parchment was crisp, the ink black, and the seal of the crown pressed deep into the wax. In the humid heat of the southern ports, the news moved faster than the riders. Plantation owners gathered in their counting rooms, reading the mandates that dismantled the foundation of their labor systems. The British administrators did not negotiate. They arrived with ledger books in hand to oversee the immediate transition of the workforce. They set up stations in local districts, processing paperwork for a top-down emancipation that ignored the protests of the local elite. The economic machinery of the region ground to a halt. Where once the output of the fields was the sole priority, now the focus shifted to the presence of British naval officers patrolling the coast. The decree acted like a wedge, splitting the interests of the local landholders from the mandates of the central government in London. The silence of the fields was replaced by the arrival of imperial enforcement officers, marking the end of the old order and the beginning of a sharp, structural defiance. In the parlors of Virginia and the humid offices of South Carolina, the silence of the plantation owners gave way to the clamor of preparation. They refused the Crown's mandate. By night, riders moved between estates, carrying letters sealed with wax that bore the mark of a new, localized defiance. Men who had spent decades managing ledgers began counting rifles and gunpowder crates instead. They pulled old muskets from wall racks and cleaned the rust from blades, the smell of oil and sulfur filling the air of formerly quiet granaries. Local militias formed in the shadows of the woods, men gathering under cover of darkness to drill in the fields. They established clandestine command posts where maps of the coastline were spread across heavy oak tables. The barons declared their intent. They would defend their lands against the reach of London. Regardless of the cost, they forged alliances, trading promises of loyalty for the promise of regional autonomy. By the end of the week, the militias were fully armed, their ranks swollen with those who feared the loss of their status more than the might of the British Empire. They waited for the signal, their eyes fixed on the horizon, watching for the first sails of the Royal Navy to break the line of the sea. The horizon off the coast of Charleston did not bring the sunrise. It brought the silhouette of the British fleet. Dozens of ships of the line crested the waves, their masts forming a forest of timber against the gray sky. The local militias, entrenched behind hastily built earthworks, watched as the lead vessel signaled. Then, the thunder began. Broadside after broadside tore into the shore, reducing the wooden fortifications to splinters and churned earth. The rebels had no answer for the crushing weight of naval artillery. Before the smoke had even cleared, landing boats hit the surf. British regulars swarmed the beaches in disciplined lines, their movements synchronized and cold. There was no chaotic charge, only the methodical advance of bayonets. The militia lines buckled, then broke, as the soldiers pushed inland toward the estates. Within hours, the centers of rebellion were occupied. Communication hubs were seized, and the leaders of the uprising were rounded up before they could organize a second stand. The professional efficiency of the empire left no room for debate. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the southern ports were under total military control, and the brief, defiant dream of the cotton barons was extinguished in the dust of their own fields. The occupation did not end with the surrender of the cotton barons. It began with the arrival of the administrators. Ships carrying officials, clerks, and surveyors docked at the occupied ports, bringing with them the cold, precise machinery of imperial law. They moved into the plantation houses, clearing the offices of the former masters. Where chaos had once dictated the lives of thousands, these officials brought ledgers and ironclad mandates. They bypassed the local courts entirely, establishing centralized boards to oversee the transition of labor. When plantation overseers attempted to obstruct the process, they were escorted away by soldiers and replaced by appointees loyal to the crown. The administrators measured land plots, registered individuals, and enforced the terms of the Emancipation Act with a clinical indifference to local sentiment. They ignored the arguments of the former elites, treating the old power structures as obstacles to be dismantled. By the end of the month, the fields were no longer controlled by the whims of the barons. A new order took root, organized from the top down and enforced by the presence of the garrison troops. The social hierarchy that had defined the region for generations was systematically erased, replaced by an imperial framework that prioritized stability and adherence to London's decree. The continent's social fabric was being rewoven, thread by thread, under the watchful eye of the empire. Across the Atlantic, the ripples of the failed American insurrection reached the gilded halls of Versailles. In a timeline where the colonies had burned their resources in a war against the crown, the French monarchy would have been hollowed out by debt. But here, the ledger remained balanced. No massive loans were funneled into the coffers of a distant rebellion. The gold that would have fueled a revolution stayed within the vaults of the French state. King Louis XVI sat at his desk, reviewing reports of agricultural yields and trade tariffs, entirely unaware of the phantom war that never demanded his treasury. Without the crushing weight of war debts, the French fiscal system did not buckle. The bread riots that were supposed to ignite the streets never found their spark. Ministers of finance remained in their positions, managing the economy with traditional, slow-moving caution. The pressure cooker of social unrest failed to reach its breaking point. In the salons of Paris, the talk remained focused on philosophy and art rather than the violent overthrow of the status quo. The monarchy held firm, its authority bolstered by the steady flow of taxes that had been spared the furnace of a foreign war. By maintaining its solvency, the crown effectively disarmed the radicals before they could organize. The stability of the continent was preserved, anchored by the unexpected success of a distant empire that kept its own house in order. The 1780s drew to a close in Paris with a quiet, persistent normalcy. The Bastille, that heavy stone monolith, remained a fortress for the state rather than a symbol of its collapse. Its gates opened and closed for supply wagons and guards, not for mobs. In the cramped quarters of the Latin Quarter, young men gathered around tables covered in pamphlets, debating the merits of liberty and equality. They spoke with fervor, yet their words bounced off the walls of the salons and dissolved into the city air. There was no widespread hunger to weaponize their rhetoric. No crowds surged toward the armories. No tremors of instability shook the foundations of the royal administration. The radical ideas remained confined to paper and ink, safely tucked away in private libraries and university lecture halls. The city authorities watched these gatherings with mild curiosity, but they saw no threat in the ink-stained fingers of the scholars. By the time the decade turned, the window for a violent rupture had sealed shut. The streets remained narrow, the order remained rigid, and the old aristocratic structures persisted, unbothered by the phantom of a revolution that never arrived. The Bastille stood silent, its walls weathered by time but untouched by the fires of history, marking the end of an era that had failed to ignite. In the quiet barracks of a provincial garrison, a young officer named Napoleon Bonaparte spent his mornings perfecting the logistics of supply lines. He was a man of precise handwriting and rigid adherence to military regulations. His career followed the predictable arc of the Royal Infantry, moving from lieutenant to captain through seniority, rather than the brutal, rapid promotions of a revolutionary battlefield. There were no wars of conquest to test his tactical genius. There were no crumbling borders to exploit. He spent his years mapping the same forest tracks and calculating the weight of grain shipments for the royal granaries. In the evenings, he sat in the mess hall, discussing the geometry of siege warfare with peers who were equally dedicated to the maintenance of the status quo. He never tasted the dust of Egypt or the frozen plains of Russia. He never stood before a cheering army as an emperor. Instead, he retired after 30 years of service with a modest pension and a collection of meticulously kept journals detailing the mundane movements of peacetime patrols. The fire of his ambition was never stoked by the winds of upheaval. He remained a small, vital cog in a massive, unmoving machine, serving a crown that demanded order above all else. The history of Europe remained a closed loop, undisturbed by the man who was destined to remain an obscure guardian of the old regime. London's navy ruled the waves, unyielding pressure, forcing Madrid and Lisbon to pivot away from extraction and toward administrative integration. The old colonial maps were redrawn. By the early 19th century, the violent wars of independence that had once threatened these territories were replaced by a series of structured, peaceful transitions into federal commonwealths. In the ports of Lima and Rio, the change was marked by the arrival of diplomatic envoys rather than insurgent armies. The focus shifted to internal stability, and the preservation of trade networks. Further north, the shift proved even more profound. Mexico retained its hold over the vast territories of California and the Southwest. Without the relentless push of an expanding republic, the mission culture flourished in the coastal valleys. Stone walls were whitewashed, orchards expanded, and the rhythmic tolling of bells marked the passage of a slow, agrarian life. The desert trails remained corridors of local travel rather than routes for pioneers. Spanish administrators and local leaders managed the land in a stable, unbroken continuum. The borders remained fixed, the cultural traditions remained deeply rooted, and the entire region settled into a quiet prosperity that spanned from the Pacific to the Gulf. The dream of continental conquest had never taken hold here, and the land remained a sanctuary of the old world order. When the drums of the Great War finally sounded, they did not rattle a fragile coalition of fractured states. The British Empire entered the conflict with a singular, terrifying advantage: the combined industrial pulse of a continent that had never known a revolution. From the blast furnaces of Pennsylvania to the sprawling shipyards of the Great Lakes, the North American interior became a continuous. Iron behemoths roared, steel, coal, munitions streamed to the sea. In the shipyards, the rhythm of hammers against iron never ceased, day or night. The sheer scale of the output was unprecedented. Every mine, every mill, and every farm across the vast territory fed into a singular imperial war machine. The crown did not have to negotiate for supplies or secure shaky alliances. It commanded a seamless supply chain that stretched from the Arctic tundra to the Caribbean refineries. Soldiers arrived at the front with an endless flow of provisions, their equipment standardized and their numbers replenished by a constant, automated stream of material. The opposition looked across the lines and saw not just an army, but the crushing, inexorable weight of a continent's total production. The industrial capacity of this unified realm turned the tide before the first major offensive had even fully matured. It was a mobilization of resources on a scale that dwarfed all previous human conflict, turning the nature of the war into a display of sheer mechanical dominance. The realization did not come in a boardroom, but in the mud of the front lines. Commanders peered through field glasses at the horizon, watching an endless, unbroken chain of supply trains and fresh battalions arriving as if from an inexhaustible spring. The opposition's artillery crew sat idle, their guns cold, as they recognized the impossible math of the situation. There was no victory to be found against a force that could replace every lost shell and every fallen soldier before the sun set. The order to cease fire rippled down the lines, carried by riders and signal lamps. One by one, the heavy cannons fell silent. The rhythmic, earth-shaking thunder that threatened to reshape the century simply stopped. Men climbed out of their defensive positions, the air suddenly thick with an unfamiliar, heavy stillness. There would be no years of attrition, no grinding cycles of trench warfare, no generation lost to the stalemate of barbed wire and gas. The slaughter had been aborted. Across the broken landscape, the sheer scale of the British-aligned bloc had rendered the conflict obsolete before it could fully metastasize. Maps remained intact, cities stayed standing, and millions of lives that were destined to be consumed by the furnace of total war remained anchored to the earth. The hinge of history had locked into place, and the era of mass industrialized combat dissolved into a quiet, negotiated peace. The map of the world settled into a new, permanent geometry. Across every continent, the borders hardened into a vast, interconnected tapestry of monarchies and protectorates, all anchored to the British center. In the frozen ports of the Arctic, merchant vessels unloaded timber and furs, while in the humid harbors of the Caribbean, ships departed heavy with sugar and spice. This was no longer a collection of competing nations, but a singular, breathing machine of commerce. Every major city from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific held a royal administrator, ensuring that the flow of goods remained constant and unchallenged. The trade routes became the veins of this new order, pulsing with the wealth of a dozen climates. From the remote mountain outposts to the bustling metropolitan squares, the flag of the crown flew as the sole authority. It was a rigid, unyielding stability. No local faction dared to challenge the economic engine that now governed the planet. The world existed as a series of nested loyalties, where the status of every territory was defined by its distance from the London throne. It was a quiet, orderly era, stripped of the chaos of revolution, where the clockwork of empire dictated the rhythm of daily life from one hemisphere to the next. In the archives of this century, the notion of a republic exists only as a footnote in crumbling, leather-bound texts. Scholars glance at the accounts of the 1776 rebellion with a detached, clinical curiosity, treating the event as a brief, irrational flicker of instability. To the modern citizen, the concept of self-governance is not a dream, but a failed experiment from a distant, primitive era. It is a whispered curiosity, easily dismissed by the logic of the crown. If a student mentions the idea of a state without a monarch, it is met with a shrug or a faint, pitying smile. The mechanism of the empire is so absolute, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of daily life, that the alternative is literally unthinkable. The documents detailing those old ambitions are left to gather dust in deep, climate-controlled vaults. No one reaches for them. No one imagines a world where the people held the power to choose their own path. That flicker of resistance, that singular moment of defiance on the icy river, has been thoroughly scrubbed from the collective memory. It is a ghost that no longer haunts the halls of power, a buried secret that has lost its weight, leaving behind a silence where the roar of revolution once stood. The Delaware River flows today as it did centuries ago, but the banks are marked not by the chaos of war, but by the quiet efficiency of imperial infrastructure. Stone bridges span the icy currents where wooden hulls once scraped against the slush. The patrol that night did not launch a revolution. It secured an era. Across the globe, the modern world functions under a sky defined by the reach of the crown. From the bustling trade hubs in the Ohio Valley to the managed protectorates of the Pacific, the architecture of power is seamless. There are no monuments to rebels, only the enduring presence of royal administrators, ensuring the gears of commerce turn without friction. History did not veer into the turbulence of independence. It held its course, anchored by that singular, frozen moment in 1776. The hinge of history swung toward the throne, and it never wavered. Citizens walk beneath the same sun, but they look up to see a world built on the foundation of a singular, unbroken order. It is a reality forged in the silence that followed the gunfire on the river. The experiment of the Republic remained a phantom, while the empire grew into the solid, unyielding sky that covers the world today. History is not a straight line. It is a web of choices, and we are living in only one strand of it. If this journey through a world that never was has sparked something in your mind, a question, a protest, a desire to see more ghost timelines brought to light, then I ask you to support this channel.